My name is Elena Hartwell. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where composure is valued more than candor, and reliability often matters more than visibility. I've held roles that sit quietly at the center of things, close enough to know how decisions are made, but far enough that people rarely look too closely at who is holding everything together. People usually describe me as calm, low maintenance, someone who doesn't take things personally. And for a long time, I believed that was a compliment. I thought it meant I was emotionally intelligent, mature, and professional. What I didn't realize, at least not at first, was how easily calm gets confused with consent. How often is interpreted as acceptance rather than restraint. This story isn't about anger or retaliation or exposing anyone publicly. It's not a warning or a takedown. It's a record, a careful, honest account of how trust erodes when it's treated as something casual, something reusable, until one day it simply expires. The moment that changed everything was small on the surface. A private message I sent, never intended for anyone else, was shared by a coworker. Not maliciously, at least not in the dramatic sense. No confrontation followed, no apology that mattered. Just a quiet realization settling in my body. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern finally revealing itself. What you're about to hear is the story of how I went from being invisible by default to being deliberate by choice. How I stopped explaining my discomfort in hopes that someone would care, and how I learned that emotional justice doesn't require punishment. It requires clarity. Over the next parts, I'll take you through how I was perceived by the people around me, the subtle ways respect was diluted, and how small acts of disregard were normalized until they felt almost reasonable. I'll talk about the role I was assigned without my consent and the moment I quietly stepped out of it, without announcing that I was leaving. There are no dramatic confrontations here. No shouting matches, no heroes or villains, just ordinary people behaving the way they do when they believe access to someone is guaranteed. And one woman who decided, internally, calmly, that it wasn't. I'm sharing this not to invite sympathy, but to offer recognition. Because many of us have been in situations where something private was handled too lightly or where our steadiness made others careless. And instead of reacting loudly, we adjusted inward. Strategically, permanently. If you've ever been relied on more than you were respected, if you've ever felt that people only valued your presence when it made their lives easier, this story may sound familiar. So before we begin properly, I want to ask you one simple question. No judgment, no pressure. Have you ever realized that someone only respected your boundaries because they believed you would never enforce them? To most people at work, I was dependable background noise. Not invisible in the sense that no one knew my name, but invisible in the way furniture is invisible. You notice it when it's missing, not while it's quietly doing its job. I was the person who remembered deadlines without reminders, who smoothed over misunderstandings before they escalated, who filled in gaps without needing credit. When something ran seamlessly, my contribution disappeared into the result. They described me with words that sounded flattering on the surface. Grounded, calm, unproblematic. Someone once said, half laughing, "Elena never gets rattled." It was meant as praise. What it really meant was, Elena won't push back. In meetings, I wasn't interrupted aggressively. I was simply moved past. If I spoke early, my point would resurface later, rephrased by someone else, louder, and suddenly it belonged to them. If I waited, the decision was often already made. No one thought this was unfair, least of all me. I told myself it was efficiency. I told myself I didn't need the spotlight to know my value. I was the coworker people felt safe confiding in because I listened without reacting. I didn't gossip. I didn't escalate. I absorbed information the way a notebook absorbs ink, quietly, completely. That made me useful. It also made me predictable. When pressure hit the team, my name surfaced naturally. Elena can handle it. When someone missed context, they'd say, "Just ask Elena, she knows." I became a human reference point, less a person, more a function. And functions, I would later learn, are rarely protected. What's important to understand is that none of this felt cruel at the time. There was no single act I could point to and say, that's where respect ended. It was more like a slow drift, each interaction reasonable on its own, each expectation is justifiable, until the sum of them quietly redefined my role. I didn't challenge it because I didn't see it as a problem yet. I believed professionalism meant emotional neutrality. That being easy to work with was a strength, not a liability. And in many ways it was, until it became the only way people knew how to relate to me. I noticed that people rarely asked how I felt about decisions that directly affected my workload. They informed me, assumed, thanked me afterward. Gratitude replaced consent, and I let it. Because gratitude feels warm, it masks an imbalance. I was trusted with logistics, with sensitive information, with keeping things running smoothly. But I wasn't trusted with influence. Or rather, no one thought to protect my influence because I never demanded it. And I didn't resent them for that. Not then. I believed that if something crossed a line, I would feel it clearly, that there would be a moment sharp enough to react to. What I didn't account for was how adaptable we become when we're praised for endurance. Looking back now, I can see the pattern forming even before the incident that anchors this story. The private message, the quiet breach. The moment trust didn't shatter but thinned. But at that time, I still believed my steadiness was mutual respect. I believed discretion went both ways. I believed that being careful with others meant they would be careful with me. I was wrong, but not in the way people expect. No one set out to undermine me. They simply interacted with the version of me that required the least consideration, and I had helped build her. That's who I was to them, reliable, contained, endlessly reasonable. And at the time, I thought that was enough. The first time something felt off, it didn't announce itself as betrayal. It arrived disguised as something almost forgettable. It was a message I sent during a long workday. Private, contextual, meant for one person only. A coworker I had worked closely with, someone I'd supported through tight deadlines and difficult conversations. The message wasn't emotional in a dramatic way. It was thoughtful, candid, a moment of professional honesty paired with personal context, the kind of message you send when you believe discretion is mutual. A few days later, I was in a small group discussion when I heard my own words, slightly altered, stripped of tone, repeated out loud. At first, I thought I was mistaken. That familiar sensation where your mind tries to protect you by offering alternatives. Maybe it just sounds similar. Maybe I'm overthinking it. I stayed quiet. I listened. Then a specific phrase landed, one I knew because I don't use it often. One I had typed carefully. The room didn't react. No gasps, no awkward silence. The conversation simply continued, my words now detached from me, repurposed as context. No one looked at me to check how I felt. No one noticed the shift in my posture, the way my attention narrowed. I smiled lightly, nodded, did what I always did, kept things moving. Later that day, I asked the coworker about it, casually, without accusation. I framed it as curiosity because that was safer. Their response came quickly and without concern. Oh yeah, I mentioned it. It felt relevant. That was it. No pause. No apology. No recognition that the message had been private. Not confidential in a legal sense, but personal in a professional way. The kind of trust you don't spell out because you assume it's understood. I remember the exact moment my body registered something my mind hadn't yet caught up with. A small tightening. Not anger, more like disappointment without a clear direction to go. They didn't mean harm. I believe that. But they also didn't mean care. And that distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. I let it go. Outwardly, at least. I said something neutral. I didn't explain why it bothered me. I didn't want to make it heavy. I told myself it wasn't worth escalating, that I was being sensitive. That professionalism meant absorbing small discomforts without making them communal. Everyone else moved on immediately, because for them nothing had happened. But I remembered. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just accurately. I remembered how easily my words were shared, how natural it felt to them, how unnecessary it seemed in their eyes to check with me first. That's the thing about the first cut. It doesn't hurt much. It just teaches you where the edge is. In the days that followed, nothing changed on the surface. We still collaborated, still joked lightly, still operated within the same rhythms. But something in me adjusted, quietly, almost imperceptibly. I noticed myself choosing words more carefully, removing personal context, replacing specificity with generalities. I told myself it was maturity, efficiency, growth. What it really was recalibration. I didn't confront because I didn't yet have language for what had shifted. It wasn't a violation I could point to without sounding dramatic. It was simply information. This is how my trust is handled here. And once you have that information, you don't unlearn it. At the time, I believed this was an isolated moment, a lapse in judgment, a reminder to be more careful. I hadn't yet seen it as the beginning of a pattern. But patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat until you're forced to name them. And this was the first time I realized that something private to me could become public, without malice, without warning, and without consequence. That stayed with me. After that first moment, nothing dramatic followed, and that, in a way, made it easier to dismiss. There were no repeat incidents that looked identical. No one quoted my messages again in quite the same way. Instead, something more subtle happened, a gradual loosening of care. Boundaries didn't get crossed loudly. They were stepped over quietly, as if no one noticed they were there. Information I shared in confidence would resurface later as general awareness. Context I offered privately would appear in group conversations, stripped of its source. My name wasn't attached to these details, but neither was my consent. It was as if anything I said, once released, became communal property. I noticed it, each time, but I also explained it away. I told myself this was how collaborative environments worked. Those ideas and insights naturally circulate. It was unrealistic to expect strict ownership over words once they're spoken. I reminded myself that nothing being shared was damaging exactly. Just personal. And because it wasn't catastrophic, I didn't react. This is how normalization happens. Not because the behavior escalates, but because your threshold quietly shifts. I began editing myself before speaking. Not in an anxious way, more in a practical one. I stopped sharing reasoning and stuck to conclusions. I reduced nuance. I removed emotion. If something couldn't be misinterpreted, it also couldn't be misused. No one commented on the change. Why would they? From the outside, I was still calm, still cooperative, still Elena. And in many ways, I encouraged the pattern by staying functional, by continuing to deliver, by not attaching a consequence to carelessness. I told myself that staying quiet was strategic, that drawing attention to these moments would only create tension, that professionalism meant choosing which battles were worth fighting. And this felt too small, too abstract. But too small things accumulate. I started noticing how quickly people assumed access to my time, my thoughts, my emotional labor, how rarely they checked in before sharing something I had told them in a one-on-one. It wasn't that they didn't like me, it was that they didn't consider me. And I let that go too, because I had always been the person who could absorb it. Part of me believed that if I continued to be generous, the environment would eventually reciprocate, that people would recognize my discretion and respond in kind. I believed in balance, even when there was no evidence for it. Another part of me, quieter, more observant, was already taking notes. Not in a vengeful way, just mentally, tracking patterns, learning where care was optional and where it wasn't. I remember thinking at one point, if this were happening to someone else, I'd tell her to speak up. But when it came to me, I stayed composed, because I didn't want to be perceived as difficult. or sensitive, or worse, emotional. So I normalized it. I reframed it as part of the cost of being trusted, of being central, of being competent. What I didn't realize then was that trust, when it isn't protected, becomes a liability. I wasn't being respected more because I was flexible. I was being handled more loosely. And the more I tolerated it, the more invisible the line became. Still, I didn't pull away completely. I didn't shut down. I just narrowed the channel, offered less, shared less, expected less. From the outside, nothing changed. From the inside, something important did. I stopped assuming good faith. Not because I thought people were malicious, but because I had learned that my care wasn't mirrored. And when care is one-sided, silence stops being a virtue and starts being self-erasure. At the time, I thought I was choosing peace, that I was being mature, that letting things go was a sign of emotional intelligence. Now I know it was something else. It was me learning, slowly, quietly, what it costs to stay agreeable in a space that doesn't protect your dignity. And I was paying that cost without ever sending the invoice. By the time I noticed the role I'd been assigned, I had already been playing it for years. I was the stabilizer, the translator, the person who smoothed rough edges so others didn't have to. When there was tension, I absorbed it. When there was ambiguity, I clarified it. When something needed to be handled delicately, my name came up. Not because I was the most authoritative, but because I was the least disruptive. People trusted me to manage complexity quietly. What they didn't do was ask whether I wanted to keep carrying it. The expectations were never spoken aloud, which made them harder to challenge. I was simply there, filling gaps, catching details, making sure things didn't fall apart. And because I did it well, the role solidified. It became part of how others understood me. Reliable, useful, invisible. I realized this most clearly during a project handoff. A decision had been made without my input, one that directly increased my workload. It was presented to me as a conclusion, not a question. There was no malice in it, just an assumption. "You're good with this kind of thing," someone said. Not unkindly, not apologetically either. And in that moment, something clicked. This wasn't about oversight, it was about expectation. I had become the person whose consent was implied, whose flexibility was taken for granted, whose boundaries were considered elastic because they had never snapped. I noticed how often people spoke around me rather than with me when it came to decisions that affected me, how my calm was used as reassurance that everything was fine, even when no one had checked. I wasn't seen as someone who needed protection because I had never asked for it. I wasn't seen as someone whose trust needed to be handled carefully because I had always handled it carefully myself. And roles like that are comfortable for everyone else. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction carried a subtext I hadn't named before. The casual way people shared things I told them privately. The assumption that I'd adapt. The expectation that I'd stay neutral. I had been cast as the steady presence, the emotional buffer, the person who could be leaned on without leaning back. And I had accepted that role because it aligned with how I wanted to be seen. Capable, composed, generous. What I hadn't accounted for was how one-sided it had become. I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting anything. I was simply aware, for the first time, that I was being related to as a function, not a full participant. And once that awareness settled in, it changed how I listened. I began to hear what wasn't being said, to notice who apologized and who never felt the need to see how often my understanding was assumed but rarely reciprocated. Still, I didn't confront anyone, not yet, because confronting the role would have required explaining something I had helped create. It would have meant saying, I let this go on too long, and I wasn't ready to do that. Instead, I observed. I watched how easily people defaulted to me when things got complicated, how quickly they moved on when I didn't object, how little space there was for me to say no without explanation. And I started to understand something fundamental. Roles persist not because they are fair, but because they are convenient. Mine was convenient, and that was the moment I knew. something would have to change. Not loudly, not publicly, but deliberately. The day something shifted didn't come with an argument or a dramatic realization. It arrived quietly, almost politely, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. I was reviewing a thread of messages, nothing urgent, nothing emotional, when I saw it again. A detail I had shared privately, now referenced casually in a broader context. No credit, no acknowledgement, no sense that it might not belong there. And this time, instead of feeling a small sting or brushing it aside, I felt empty, not hurt, not surprised, just finished. It wasn't that this particular instance was worse than the others. It was that my body no longer tried to rationalize it. The internal dialogue that used to soften everything. They didn't mean it. It's not worth addressing. This is just how things work. Went quiet. In its place was a simple, steady thought. I don't owe this dynamic anything anymore. I remember leaning back in my chair and looking around the room. The same desk, the same muted hum of the office. The same people are moving through their routines. Nothing external had changed. But internally, something had settled into place. It felt like clarity without urgency. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send a message. I didn't mark the moment publicly. I simply closed the thread and opened my notebook, the one I'd been carrying for years without quite knowing why. For the first time, I wrote not as a way to process feelings, but as a way to observe reality. I noted dates, context, patterns, not with suspicion, just accuracy. I stopped asking myself how things should be and started recording how they were. That was the shift. I realized I had been hoping for consideration from people who had no incentive to offer it. Not because they were cruel, but because the system we were in rewarded convenience, not care. And I had been very convenient. The moment didn't feel empowering in a cinematic way. It felt grounded, almost mundane, like adjusting your posture after realizing you've been sitting uncomfortably for too long. I understood then that silence didn't have to mean endurance. It could mean choice. Up until that point, my quiet had been reactive, absorbing, adapting, smoothing. From that afternoon on, it became intentional. I began to decide what I would no longer volunteer for, what access would quietly revoke, what information would stay mine unless there was a clear, mutual reason to share it. Not as punishment, not as manipulation, as alignment. I didn't change my tone. I didn't become colder. If anything, I became more precise. Less available by default, more present by design. No one noticed immediately. Why would they? I was still doing my job, still participating, still calm. But the internal contract had changed. I stopped assuming that being understanding would be reciprocated. I stopped offering emotional context to people who hadn't earned it. I stopped mistaking familiarity for trust. And with that, a sense of quiet control returned. Not over others, but over myself. I wasn't angry at the coworker who had shared my private message. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I'd simply reached the point where I no longer needed one to move forward. Trust, I realized, isn't something you explain the loss of. It's something you adjust your behavior around. That afternoon, without ceremony, I stopped operating under expired terms. And everything that followed came from that decision. After that day, my silence changed its texture. Before, it had been soft, absorbing, accommodating, shaped by the desire to keep things smooth. Now it was clean, deliberate, a boundary that didn't need announcing because it was enforced through consistency. I spoke when there was value. I withheld when there wasn't. This wasn't about playing games or testing people. It was about no longer offering parts of myself automatically. Information, context, and emotional labor, these became choices instead of habits. From the outside, I imagine it looked like nothing at all. I still attended meetings, still responded to messages, still did my work well, but I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine. When conversations drifted into speculation, I didn't rescue them with clarity. When someone asked for context they hadn't bothered to understand, I pointed them to the source instead of translating it myself. People began to notice, not consciously, but instinctively. There were small pauses where there hadn't been any before. Moments where someone waited for me to step in, and I didn't. Not because I couldn't, but because I no longer felt responsible for maintaining everyone else's comfort. A few people interpreted this as fatigue, others as detachment. No one considered that it might be an intention. That's the thing about quiet shifts, they're almost always misread. One coworker commented, half joking, "You've been so low-key lately." I smiled. Let it pass. I wasn't interested in correcting their interpretation. Because if people believe your silence is weakness, they reveal how they think power works. I watched carefully as the dynamics adjusted. Some people filled the space I left with more noise. Others grew uncomfortable without my mediation. A few, interestingly, became more respectful, checking in before sharing, asking instead of assuming. Those were the ones paying attention. What surprised me most was how little effort this required. I wasn't enforcing rules or drawing lines. I was simply no longer cushioning the impact of others' carelessness. And in doing so, I learned something important. Many relationships are sustained not by mutual respect, but by one person doing the emotional maintenance for everyone else. When that person stops, the imbalance becomes visible. I didn't announce my boundaries because I didn't need them validated. I let behavior do the talking. If someone handled information carefully, they continued to have access. If they didn't, that access narrowed naturally. This wasn't punishment. It was calibration. And yes, some people mistook it for withdrawal, for disengagement, for passivity. That misunderstanding worked in my favor, because while they assumed I was stepping back, I was paying closer attention than ever. I listened more than I spoke. I documented instead of venting. I observed patterns without reacting to them. I stopped explaining myself to people who had never explained themselves to me. And in that quiet, something else began to happen. I started to see the system more clearly. Who shared information responsibly and who didn't. Who respected discretion and who treated it casually. Who apologized when they crossed a line and who assumed there wouldn't be one. Silence gave me data. And data gave me leverage. Not in a manipulative sense, but in a grounding one. I understood where I stood. I understood what was safe to share and what wasn't. I understood that my calm had been doing more work than anyone realized. So I let them believe what they wanted, that I was tired, that I was less engaged, that I was simply coasting, because the truth was much quieter and much more decisive. I wasn't withdrawing. I was repositioning. What they never noticed was how much information lives in the background when you stop performing. When I stopped filling the silence, I gained time. When I stopped smoothing over confusion, I gained clarity. And when I stopped explaining myself, I gained distance. Enough to see the structure I had been standing inside without ever naming it. I began documenting seriously then. Not out of paranoia and not because I expected a confrontation. I documented because I had learned that memory favors whoever speaks last, not whoever is most accurate. Dates, context. Who said what? Where did the information travel after it left me? Which details were shared responsibly, and which ones seemed to grow legs the moment they were spoken? I wasn't collecting evidence for revenge. I was building a record for myself so I wouldn't be tempted later to minimize what I had seen. At the same time, I started learning, quietly, methodically. I familiarized myself with policies I had previously trusted others to interpret. I read the fine print instead of assuming good faith. I learned what discretion meant in formal terms, not just social ones. Where responsibility ended, where accountability began. This wasn't dramatic preparation, it was competence redirected. I also stopped centralizing myself unnecessarily. I delegated visibility upward instead of inward. I made sure decisions were documented, not implied. If something affected my workload or responsibility, I asked for it in writing, not confrontationally, just clearly. No one questioned it. Why would they? It looked like diligence, professionalism, organization, which it was. But it was also positioning. I noticed how often people relied on ambiguity to stay comfortable, how rarely they clarified expectations when they assumed someone else would adapt. and how quickly that ambiguity disappeared when accountability entered the room. I wasn't changing the rules, I was simply playing by the ones that actually existed. There were moments when I could have stepped in and made things easier for others. Old instincts tugged at me then, the urge to be helpful, to smooth the path. But I held back, not out of spite, out of respect for myself. I wanted to see how things functioned without my constant adjustment. I wanted to know which systems were stable and which ones depended on my silence to survive. The answers were illuminating. Some processes collapsed into confusion without mediation. Some people struggled when they had to articulate things they had previously assumed I'd handle. Others adapted quickly and treated me with more care once they realized my calm came with boundaries. Those differences mattered. What they never noticed was that I was becoming less reactive and more deliberate by the day, that my emotional energy was no longer tied to being understood, that I wasn't waiting for permission to redefine my role. I stopped correcting misconceptions about myself. If someone thought I was disengaged, I let them. If they assumed I was less invested, I didn't rush to disprove it. Because I had learned something crucial. Visibility is only power if it's protected. And I was done being visible without protection. There was a particular calm that settled over me during this period. Not relief, not triumph, just steadiness. I slept better. I second-guessed myself less. I trusted my own perception because I had finally stopped arguing with it. I knew exactly where trust had thinned. I knew which relationships were transactional and which ones were reciprocal. And I knew that when the moment came to act, not emotionally but structurally, I would be ready. Still, I didn't rush anything. Preparation, I learned, is invisible by design. And while others assumed nothing had changed, I was quietly ensuring that when something did change, it would be irreversible, not because it was dramatic, but because it was grounded in reality. They never noticed the shift, but by then I no longer needed them to. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no sense of victory, no internal applause. It arrived the way most truths do when you've done your homework, quietly, almost anticlimactically. I was reviewing documentation one evening, cross-checking notes I had taken weeks apart. Nothing urgent had prompted it. I had simply developed the habit of verifying things instead of assuming they were handled correctly. That was when I noticed the inconsistency. At first, it looked like a minor oversight. A procedural gap, the kind of thing people gloss over because it's inconvenient to slow down and fix. But the more I read, the clearer it became. Something important had been mishandled, not once but repeatedly, and I had been positioned close enough to see it clearly. What mattered wasn't that the mistake existed. It was that responsibility for it had quietly drifted, never formally assigned, never documented, just implied. In the same way, many expectations around me had always been implied. Except this time the implications didn't point toward me. They pointed away. I sat with that realization longer than I expected, not to savor it. There was nothing satisfying about it. But to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding, I reread policies, I checked timelines, I reviewed communications. The conclusion didn't change. For the first time in a long while, I had leverage, not because I had been wronged, but because I had been accurate. And that distinction mattered. This wasn't leverage that could be used loudly. It wasn't a gotcha. It wasn't something you announce. In fact, its strength depended entirely on how quietly it was held. I didn't tell anyone. Not a friend, not a mentor, not even myself in emotional terms. I simply acknowledged it and kept going. Because leverage, when treated emotionally, becomes unstable. I understood then that the power wasn't in exposing the situation. It was in not needing to. The knowledge shifted how I moved through the space. Conversations that once made me uneasy now felt neutral. Requests that used to trigger a sense of obligation no longer did. I knew exactly where I stood and how little I owed to dynamics built on assumption. I also realized something else. The coworker who had shared my private message hadn't done the most damage. They had simply revealed the culture I was in. A culture where discretion was optional until it became inconvenient. And now I understood the system well enough to step out of it cleanly. There was no fantasy of confrontation playing in my mind, no speech prepared, no desire to correct anyone's behavior. What I felt instead was certainty. The kind that comes when you stop trying to be understood and start making decisions that don't require explanation. I knew then that whatever I chose to do next had to be irreversible, not in impact, but in intention. I couldn't go back to hoping people would handle me with care. I couldn't unknow what I knew. So I didn't rush. I let the knowledge settle. Let it inform my choices without announcing itself. Let it sit quietly behind my calm, the way gravity sits behind stillness. If anyone noticed a difference, they didn't comment. Why would they? From the outside, I was still the same Elena, measured, capable, unreactive. What they couldn't see was that the center had shifted. I no longer needed validation. I no longer needed to prove anything. I no longer needed to be careful in the way I had before. Because clarity had replaced hope. And with it came the understanding that trust doesn't have to be broken to expire. Sometimes it simply runs out, used up by carelessness, by assumption, by repetition. This was the moment I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. Not because I was bitter, but because I was done pretending not to see what was right in front of me. Once you see clearly, indecision becomes its own kind of choice. I reached a point where I could no longer pretend I was simply observing. The knowledge I had gained about patterns, responsibility, and how casually my trust had been handled required a response. Not an emotional one, but a structural one. There were several paths available to me. I could have addressed the situation directly, asked for explanations, requested apologies. That option would have preserved the appearance of openness, but it also would have required me to re-enter dynamics I no longer trusted. It would have meant teaching people how to treat me again. I could have escalated formally, filed complaints, forced accountability through official channels. That would have created immediate consequences, but it would also have turned the situation into something adversarial, public, draining. Or I could do nothing, stay, continue adapting, protect myself quietly, and accept the limits of the environment. That last option was tempting in its familiarity. I knew how to survive there. I knew how to stay composed, how to minimize risk, how to make myself small enough not to be mishandled. But survival wasn't the same as alignment anymore. The irreversible option wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve exposure or confrontation. It involved withdrawal of trust, of emotional labor, of long-term commitment. I decided I would stop building my future in a space that treated my boundaries as flexible. That decision changed everything, even though no one could see it yet. I began planning, not an exit in the theatrical sense, but a reorientation. I evaluated what staying actually costs me, what would be required, what I needed to carry forward, and what I could leave behind without explanation. The key was timing. I didn't want to react. I wanted to move from stability, from clarity, from a position where my choices couldn't be framed as emotional. So I waited. I continued doing my work well. I maintained professionalism. I didn't burn bridges or create tension, but internally I had stopped investing in repair. Trust, once expired, doesn't get renewed through conversation. It gets renewed through consistent care. And I had seen enough to know that wasn't coming. The decision felt quiet, but firm, like closing a door gently and locking it without announcing that you've done so. I wasn't choosing revenge. I wasn't choosing silence as punishment. I was choosing alignment over familiarity. And I knew, once that choice was made, I wouldn't reverse it. Not because I was stubborn, but because I finally respected myself enough not to negotiate my boundaries in hopes of comfort. That was the point of no return. Once the decision was made, the work became almost meditative. There was no rush, no visible change in my demeanor. I understood something important then. The most effective transitions don't announce themselves. They blend into routine until the outcome is already in motion. I started by separating emotion from logistics. I reviewed my responsibilities with a colder eye, not resentful, just factual. What was formally mine? what I had been informally carrying, where my name appeared in writing and where it didn't. I corrected that imbalance quietly. If something wasn't documented, I documented it. If expectations were vague, I asked for clarity. Once. Not repeatedly, just once. I consulted policies the way someone consults a map, not a weapon. I wasn't looking for loopholes. I was looking for alignment, making sure my actions were grounded, defensible, and clean. At the same time, I began restructuring my personal commitments. Not dramatically, just deliberately. I stopped volunteering for initiatives that had no clear benefit. I declined invitations that relied on my emotional labor rather than my expertise. I protected my time without announcing that I was doing so. Financially, I made adjustments too. Quiet ones, I reviewed contracts, evaluated options, built contingencies, nothing reckless, nothing sudden. The point wasn't escape, it was independence. And through all of this, no one noticed. They couldn't. I hadn't changed my tone or my performance. I had simply stopped compensating for systems that expected me to overextend. There's a kind of invisibility that comes when people assume you're still operating under old terms. They don't look closely. They don't ask questions. They rely on patterns. And I let them. I understood that if anyone realized what I was doing too early, they might try to intervene, not out of care, but out of discomfort. People resist change when it disrupts their convenience. So I moved slowly, carefully, with respect for process. I didn't share my plans, not because they were secretive, but because they weren't communal. This was my transition, and it didn't require consensus. The coworker who had shared my private message continued interacting with me as usual. Polite, casual, oblivious, I held no animosity toward them. They had played their part unknowingly, revealing what I needed to see. Others continued to rely on my steadiness, unaware that I had already recalibrated how much of it they would receive. This was the quiet power of moving in silence. Nothing needed to be justified. Nothing needed to be defended. The narrative stayed neutral because there was no narrative yet. I wasn't hiding, I was preparing. And preparation, when done correctly, looks exactly like normalcy. There were moments when the old version of me would have stepped in, offered help, smoothed over confusion, made things easier. Each time I paused, asked myself one question. Is this aligned with the future I'm building or the role I'm leaving? If it was the latter, I let it go. Not bitterly, not performatively, cleanly. By the time everything was in place, the shift had already happened. It just hadn't been felt yet. That's how irreversible change works. Quiet on the front end. Obvious only in retrospect. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They surfaced the way absence does. Noticed only after something stops being there. At first, there was some confusion. A missed detail. A delay that shouldn't have happened. Someone asking a question that used to be answered before it was even fully formed. I watched it unfold without satisfaction, without relief, just observation. People began to feel friction in places that had always been smooth. Processes slowed, decisions stalled. Not catastrophically, but enough to be felt. Enough to be... And still, no one connected it to me. They assumed it was circumstantial. A busy period, a temporary oversight, because for so long my presence had masked inefficiencies. My discretion had absorbed impact. My calm had filled gaps no one realized existed. Now that cushioning was gone, what struck me was how quickly discomfort spread once it had no place to land. People started checking in with each other more, repeating conversations, searching for clarity that had once been quietly supplied. A few times someone would come to me with a familiar tone, expecting translation, mediation, reassurance, and I would respond professionally, but minimally. I answered the question asked, nothing more. They would pause, slightly unsettled, then move on. No one accused me of withholding. They couldn't. I was still doing my job. I had simply stopped doing everyone else's. That distinction mattered. There was a moment in a meeting when someone said, half joking, We're missing Elena's magic touch lately. It was meant lightly, nostalgically. I smiled, the way you do when something confirms what you already know. Because it wasn't magic. It was labor. And it had been invisible until it stopped. Gradually, the tone shifted. Not toward me, but toward each other. Small irritations surfaced. Accountability became a topic. People started noticing where assumptions had been standing in for structure. And with that came discomfort. Not anger, confusion. They felt the loss of something, but they couldn't name it. They didn't know when it had left or why. All they knew was that things felt harder. I remained steady throughout, not withdrawn, not cold, just consistent. Some people adapted. They stepped up. They communicated more clearly. They respected boundaries once they encountered them. Others struggled. They reached outward, looking for the old version of me, the one who would absorb, translate, fix. I didn't reappear. Because consequences don't require confrontation. They only require follow-through. What surprised me most was how neutral it all felt. I had expected guilt, or second-guessing, or the urge to explain myself. None of that came. I felt grounded. This wasn't about proving a point. It was about no longer being the quiet solution to problems I hadn't created. The coworker who had shared my private message began to seem uneasy around me. Not because I treated them differently, but because something had changed that they couldn't locate. They didn't apologize again. They didn't ask questions. They simply adjusted their behavior slightly. More careful, more reserved. It was too late for trust, but not too late for learning. And I was okay with that. The consequences weren't loud. They didn't humiliate anyone. They simply revealed what had been relying on my silence to function. And once revealed, those things had to be dealt with by the people who owned them. I wasn't angry. I was finished carrying what wasn't mine. By the time people realized something was wrong, they assumed it was temporary. That was the first mistake. There was a subtle shift in tone. Emails framed more carefully. Conversations that circled back to things that should have been settled already. A few people started checking in with me more often, not directly about me, but about how things were going lately. It wasn't a concern, it was orientation. They were trying to find their footing in a space that no longer adjusted itself around them. Someone asked lightly, "Have you noticed things feeling a bit off?" I nodded, neutral. There's been some transition. That word, transition, landed heavier than I expected. I watched it register, then pass. No follow-up questions, no curiosity about what it meant. They still believed this was fixable. If they tweaked a few processes, smoothed a few conversations, things would return to how they were. But what they didn't understand was that the stability they missed wasn't procedural, it was relational. And relational trust, once expired, doesn't renew retroactively. I began to sense unease. Subtle but present. Meetings where people over-explained. Messages sent with an extra layer of politeness. An unspoken awareness that something had changed, paired with uncertainty about how to address it. A few people tried to reconnect socially. Casual check-ins, nostalgic references. Remember when we used to? I remembered. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that they were trying to restore comfort without acknowledging cost. No one said, "We should have been more careful." No one said, "We assumed too much." No one asked what had shifted for me. They just wanted the system to work again. And it couldn't. Because the system had relied on my unspoken compliance. I watched people attempt to fix outcomes instead of causes, to adjust surfaces while ignoring foundations. It wasn't malicious. It was human. But it was also too late. The coworker who had shared my private message grew noticeably anxious. Not confrontational, just restless. They hovered near conversations, offered help they hadn't before, and avoided certain topics. At one point they said, "I hope everything's okay between us." I met their eyes and said calmly, "We're fine." And we were. Fine didn't mean close, it didn't mean open, it didn't mean unchanged. It meant resolved. I didn't explain further because there was nothing to explain that would lead anywhere new. The moment for repair had passed. Not because I was unforgiving, but because I had already restructured my boundaries. People often think repair requires confrontation. Sometimes it does, but sometimes repair requires timing, and timing had been missed. I could feel a quiet panic spreading, not outwardly, but internally among the team. Not fear of punishment, but fear of instability, of not knowing who would catch things now, of having to carry weight they hadn't noticed before. And still no one named it. Because naming it would require admitting that something had been taken for granted. I stayed composed through all of it. Not out of detachment, but out of finality. I had already adjusted, already moved forward. Watching them scramble didn't bring satisfaction. It brought confirmation. Confirmation that my silence had been doing far more work than anyone realized, and that once withdrawn, no amount of surface-level care could replace it. Trust doesn't collapse into chaos, it fades in neglect. And once gone, it doesn't respond to urgency. By the time they were ready to fix it, I was no longer participating in the version of things they wanted restored. Not because I was punishing anyone, but because I had already chosen something else. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like one. There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause, no sense of stakes in the way people usually imagine them. It came quietly, in a scheduled conversation that was framed as a check-in. Neutral language, neutral room, neutral tone. Which was fitting because by then, neutrality was all that remained. They asked how I was feeling about things. Not directly, not personally. More as a general inquiry, the kind meant to open a door without committing to walking through it. I answered honestly, but briefly. I'm clear about my boundaries, I said, and I'm working within them. There was a pause, the kind where someone waits for elaboration. I didn't offer it. Eventually, the coworker, the one who had shared my private message, spoke. Their voice was careful. If I crossed a line before, I hope you know that wasn't intentional. I believed them. I do, I said, and I meant it. Another pause, longer this time. What they were waiting for was forgiveness in the form of access, a return to how things were, reassurance that intention mattered more than impact. But that wasn't what this conversation was for. I'm not holding on to resentment, I continued calmly. I just adjusted how much I share. That was it. No accusation, no explanation of why, no inventory of past moments, just a statement of present reality. They nodded slowly. Not relieved, not defensive, just aware. Someone else asked if there was anything they could do to make things easier. It sounded sincere, also late. I considered the question carefully before answering. No, I said, things are already clear. And they were. This was the part people rarely talk about, the kind of confrontation that doesn't resolve anything because there's nothing left to negotiate. I wasn't angry. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I wasn't asking for change. I had already changed. What they felt in that moment wasn't guilt. It was loss. The quiet realization that something they assumed would always be available no longer was. And there was no argument they could make against that. Because boundaries don't require agreement, the conversation ended politely. Cordially, everyone left with their composure intact. But something had closed. Not slammed, not locked loudly. Just closed. I walked back to my desk with a sense of lightness I hadn't expected, not because I had said my piece, but because I hadn't needed to. There was nothing left to clarify, no misunderstanding to correct. The truth had already been integrated into my behavior. That was the real reversal. I hadn't confronted them to be seen. I had confronted them to mark an ending, quietly, cleanly, without leaving emotional debris behind. And in doing so, I realized something important. You don't need heat to end a dynamic. You don't need validation to move on. You don't need someone else's understanding to enforce your own limits. Sometimes the most powerful confrontation is simply refusing to reopen what you've already closed. After everything settled, I noticed something unexpected. I was lighter. Not relieved in a celebratory way, not proud, just unburdened. The constant internal calculation, is this safe to share? Should I smooth this over? Am I being too much or not enough? Had gone quiet. I was no longer managing how I was perceived. I was simply present. Who I am now isn't someone harder or colder. If anything, I'm more precise. I listen carefully. I speak with intention. I share when there's mutual care, not just convenience. I no longer confuse calm with compliance. I understand now that being low drama doesn't mean being low boundary. That professionalism doesn't require emotional self-erasure, and that trust, once expired, doesn't need to be mourned loudly to be honored properly. I didn't lose my empathy in this process. I refined it. I still believe most people don't intend harm. I still understand how environments reward speed over care. But I also understand that intention doesn't undo impact, and it doesn't obligate me to stay open. I'm more selective now, not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. I notice how quickly people adjust when they realize access is earned, not assumed. Some step closer with more care. Others drift away when the dynamic no longer serves them. Both outcomes feel honest. What changed most was my relationship with silence. Silence is no longer something I default to in order to keep the peace. It's something I choose when words would dilute clarity. I speak when it matters. I let things stand when they don't. And I no longer feel the urge to explain that choice. The version of me who absorbed everything believed she was being generous. And she was. But at her own expense. I don't judge her. She did what she knew how to do with the information she had. This version of me simply knows more. I know that trust requires maintenance, that discretion is a form of care, and that when those things aren't reciprocated, the appropriate response isn't anger, it's distance. Quiet distance. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't raise my voice. I just stopped making myself available in ways that weren't respected. And in doing so, I found something steadier than validation: alignment. Who I am now is someone who understands that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like calm consistency, like boundaries enforced without explanation, like leaving a room emotionally before you ever leave it physically. And that kind of power doesn't need an audience. There's a quiet lesson in all of this that took me a long time to learn. Trust isn't a dramatic thing. It doesn't always break in moments of obvious betrayal. More often, it thins out, worn down by small acts of carelessness, by assumptions that go unchallenged, by silence that's mistaken for consent. When my coworker shared my private message, it wasn't the worst thing that could have happened. What made it decisive was what came after. The lack of care, the absence of repair, the ease with which something personal became communal. That was when trust expired. Not in anger, not in spectacle. Just naturally. And the most important part of this story isn't what I did next. It's what I didn't do. I didn't lash out. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't demand understanding. I simply adjusted my behavior to match reality. There's a misconception that emotional justice requires punishment, that someone has to be embarrassed or corrected for balance to be restored. I don't believe that anymore. Sometimes justice looks like withdrawal. Sometimes it looks like clarity without conversation. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to rebuild what was never protected. The quietest power I discovered was this: you don't need permission to stop offering what isn't handled with care. If someone mishandles your trust and continues as if nothing happened, they're telling you something. Not with words, but with behavior. And behavior is the most honest language there is. Listening to it doesn't make you cold. It makes you accurate. This story isn't an instruction manual. It's not advice. It's simply an account of what happened when I stopped explaining my boundaries and started living them. If there's a moral here, it's a simple one. You are not obligated to stay open in spaces that benefit from your silence more than they protect your dignity. You don't owe anyone access to your inner world just because you've been generous before. You don't have to wait for a dramatic moment to choose yourself, and you don't need to announce the end of a dynamic for it to be over. Sometimes the most respectful thing you can do for yourself and for others is to quietly step out of roles that were never agreed to. And if you're listening to this and recognizing parts of yourself in it, I want to leave you with one question, not rhetorical, not accusatory, just honest. Have you ever stayed silent to keep the peace, only to realize later that the peace was costing you your own sense of respect? If you're comfortable, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments.